Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I am Christine Darr. As you can read, I am Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics here at UD. I wanted to thank the Department of Philosophy, History, and Religion, as well as the Office of Academic Affairs, which paid for the nice food that you have outside. So on your way out again, go ahead and grab some more. I also wanted to thank the Cultural Committee for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And most importantly, thanks to each of you, right, who came here of your own free will to hang out and talk about the Poor People's Campaign with me. Awesome. So as a scholar of Christian social ethics, I'm interested in understanding how Christians work out their moral commitments to others in light of their religious commitments. As we're all aware, different Christians understand those religious and moral commitments differently. And I am really fascinated by understanding those differences. But in addition to that scholarly lens that I bring to this work, I am also a Christian who identifies most strongly with the prophetic tradition out of which Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign arises. So I will talk more about the prophetic tradition in a little bit, but I want to be upfront with both aspects of my identity, and then I'm bringing both of them to my analysis here. So I have some guiding questions for us to kind of lay out what we're going to do together. So we're going to consider, first of all, what is the bottom line? My grad school advisor always told me to put the bottom line up front. So that's what we're going to do. We also will consider what is the prophetic imagination. Was MLK a prophet? What was the Poor People's Campaign and why is it being revived? And how can I get involved? All right, so that's what we're doing today. So let's start. And I don't have this many words on all of my slides, so don't worry. All right, but you could say that my thesis here is that the contemporary Poor People's Campaign is the most recent manifestation of the prophetic imagination, drawing from the rich resources of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr., the gospel of Jesus, and the prophets of the Old Testament. It seeks to criticize the dominant culture, characterized by systematic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and a corrupt national morality. It also seeks to energize a massive movement of regular folks who are ready to proclaim that a new way of living is possible. So, let's go. All right. So what is the prophetic imagination? I wanted to point this out. This was a piece of art that was created by two twin brothers that live in Chicago, and they have these beautiful calendars that render the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible into these amazing, vibrant colors. So anyway. All right, so the term prophetic imagination was coined by a biblical scholar named Walter Brueggemann in 1978 in a book by the same name, The Prophetic Imagination. In this text, Brueggemann argues that I don't have enough room in here. The paying attention to the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament can call Christians back to an alternative vision of living toward which God has been calling them for millennia. Specifically, he says that the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception that is alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture that surrounds us. He points to Moses as the first exemplar of this prophetic ministry. According to Brueggemann, Moses' work as God's servant went beyond freeing a small band of people, of slaves from the Egyptians, although that is no small feat, not to minimize it. But what he did actually goes far beyond that. That Moses fundamentally challenged the dominant culture of his time, as well as created with the Israelites an alternative way of living in the world, characterized by compassion and justice. However, by the time of the reign of King Solomon in 962 BCE, Brueggemann observes that a radical shift in the foundations of Israel's life and faith had taken place. The Solomonic period is the culture in which prophets such as Jeremiah and Amos spoke out. So I could go on about Walter Brueggemann all day, but what I want to highlight for you right now are a few elements of the prophetic imagination that we can take with us into our examination of Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign. So first, Brueggemann describes the three characteristics of the Solomonic period as marked by the economics of affluence, the politics of oppression, and the establishment of a controlled and static religion. He argues that each of these characteristics functions to discourage the prophetic imagination in their own way and in an effort to secure its own power. So we'll briefly examine each of these characteristics. From King Solomon forward, many of the people of Israel and Judah experienced wealth such as they had never possessed. As it says in 1 Kings, Judah and Israel were as many as the sands of the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides harts, gazelles, roebuck, and fatted fowl. Right, so he was eating pretty good. Yeah. While this might be the typical provision of King Solomon and the royal courts, it was likely held up as the sort of life to be desired. It was not characteristic, and that sort of affluence did not extend to all of the people of Israel. This leads to the second characteristic, the politics of oppression. In order to have such opulence, the king required the labor of many of his people, sometimes forced labor if necessary, to maintain the court and its extravagant needs. Finally, these two characteristics are upheld through theological sanction, which Brueggemann describes as the establishment of a controlled and static religion. By this he means that the religious life of the temple is swept up into the service of the king and subordinated to the king's purposes. In the case of Solomon, God was accessible through the king and those to whom the king grants access, meaning that a person might only approach God on the king's terms. These three characteristics support each other in such a way as to support the power structures in place and to placate either through affluence and satiety, or discourage through oppression, all in the name of God. Then, Brueggemann observes a particular kind of response to this sort of dominant culture. It's a response that he describes as the prophetic imagination, which criticizes the dominant culture, as well as energizes people and communities with the possibility of God's promise to make all things new. Bless you. The prophetic imagination speaks out in rejection of the dominant consciousness in order to dismantle the hold it has on our imaginations. Right, so it's not just that the dominant culture can control our actions in various ways, but that it gets into our consciousness such that we no longer have the ability to dream something new. This is always a struggle. This sort of, the prophetic voice always receives pushback, oftentimes to a serious degree. The dominant culture often refuses to tolerate serious criticism and will go to great lengths to suppress it. Yet, without serious and sustained critique, the dominant culture will continue its hold on our sense of what is possible. So the first response is criticism. The second response is to energize. Right, as was said, the affluence and oppression present in the dominant culture can distract us and wear us down, or wear the people down, so that they no longer believe in these promises. The prophets speak in order to nourish and evoke that sense of possibility. So Brueggemann is really determined to emphasize that these two things need to occur simultaneously. He says that the danger in our culture is that we highlight one and not the other, right? So we have criticism without that sort of alternative possibility, or we have an alternative without ever criticizing the culture. So those, for him, are held in tension. So was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King a prophet? Last week in Blades Chapel, we commemorated the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was killed on April 4th, 1968. That was 5 years after his most lauded and most often repeated speech, "I Have a Dream." Much happened to Dr. King and to our country in the intervening years between that speech and the speech that he gave the night before he was assassinated, when he spoke of the need to stand in solidarity with the Memphis sanitation workers on strike in Memphis, the night where he seemed to predict his own death. For some people, looking back on that time, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were the full expression of what Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement was trying to achieve. And for others, that act was simply the beginning of a much larger and more radical transformation of American society. In many ways, our contemporary picture of Dr. King is something like a Rorschach image, one where people see what they want to see and use King's image in a way that best suits them. I want to show you an example that I think highlights the tension created when created by our competing understandings of who Dr. King was and what he was fighting for. This might be familiar to some of you.
If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That's a new definition of greatness. By giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know the theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics in physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace. Soul generated by love.
Okay. So that's the first depiction. And now let's watch another. So I want to note the words that you'll see are projected onto the same images, and it is from the same speech. Okay, but it's a different section of that speech.
The presence of this instinct explains why we are so often taken by advertisers. You know, those gentlemen of massive verbal persuasion. And they have a way of saying things to you that kind of gets you in the bind. In order to be a man of distinction, you must drink this whiskey. In order to make your neighbors envious, you must drive this type of car. In order to be lovely to love, you must wear this kind of lipstick or this kind of perfume. And you know, before you know it, you're just buying that stuff. And I've got to drive this car because it's something about this car that makes my car a little better than my neighbor's car. And I am sad to say that the nation in which we live is the supreme culprit. And I'm going to continue to say it to America.
Okay. So I want us to pause for a moment. Turn to your neighbor and ask what strikes them about what they just saw, about the two different versions of that commercial. What do you notice? So if you had to choose one word that would describe something about the difference between the two videos, what word would you choose?
Attitude.
Okay.
Dissatisfaction
Okay.
versus satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
Or both. Him and I had a good conversation. I said he'd turn over in his grave if he saw the commercials today. I mean, you can't even watch anything without a car commercial, and they say set your spirit free. It almost becomes a religious thing to own a vehicle. And then you think about the damn engine. We could have been using garbage by now instead of killing everybody.
Yeah.
So he was really enlightened, but oh my God, where did it go?
Yeah. Right, exactly. In my mind, these two commercials provide a really concrete way of understanding how our contemporary dominant culture seeks to distract us from the power of the prophet of that Dr. King was.
Amen.
So, was MLK a prophet? In order to answer this question, let's just briefly recall the elements of the prophetic imagination. A prophet seeks both to criticize the dominant culture and to energize the people to pursue a promise that God will make all things new. The dominant culture against which the prophets speak is characterized by the economics of affluence, the politics of oppression, and the establishment of a static religion controlled by the dominant powers. This seems to be an accurate characterization of the life and thought of Dr. King, particularly towards the end of his life. By the time he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, Dr. King had begun to even more strongly name the dominant culture. Specifically, he said, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." King recognized that consumer capitalism that dominated our social consciousness actually desensitizes people from being able to confront these evils being perpetuated by society, in his view. King also became increasingly more frustrated with and vocal in his criticism of the white moderate, those Christians who seemed to be dominated by an establishment religion that was incapable of or fearful of believing in the possibility of God radically reordering society. It can be helpful to think about the Poor People's Campaign as an effort to energize the people's prophetic imagination. Dr. King described the Poor People's Campaign as a shift from the reform movement of desegregation and voting rights to a revolutionary movement that would demand nothing less than a radical redistribution of economic and political power. In the years after the Voting Rights Act was put in place, Dr. King came to the conclusion that gaining civil rights and voting rights were a necessary first step, but were insufficient in improving the lives of African Americans. Additionally, he began to see and to argue that improving the lives of one minority was not enough. King understood the gospel to require justice, and particularly economic justice, for all people. Accordingly, Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign began to issue demands in the form of an economic Bill of Rights, which included a robust anti-poverty program, guaranteed annual income, vast increase in low-cost housing, among many other things. They did this through joining in labor struggles such as the Memphis sanitation workers strike I mentioned in 1968, as well as establishing a resurrection city, which is pictured here, on the National Mall, where they encamped for 6 weeks. Dr. King argued that there are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. In the language of the prophets, Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign were mounting a direct criticism of the central commitments of the dominant culture, particularly the militarism represented by Vietnam, a militarism that King argued desensitized society so they are unable to attend to the pain of its citizens, and funneled profits to a few people while redirecting money away from social programs. In an interview in 1967, King is quoted as saying that he knew the expansion of the movement would be more difficult. The shift from civil and voting rights would be easy in comparison for the demand of economic justice for all, because the demands of this campaign would actually cost the nation money. In other words, he was striking right at the heart of the corridors of power. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, just a few months after the sanitation workers' strike, and after years of being surveilled and often publicly demonized by the FBI. With his assassination, the Poor People's Campaign lost its charismatic leader and had a difficult time continuing its mission of economic justice for all God's children. So why is it being revived? In the 50 years since the original Poor People's Campaign, 50 years to a couple days ago, it is safe to say that although a few things have gotten better, the triple giants of racism, materialism, and militarism have not lessened, and in many ways have only gotten worse. I'll say more about that shortly. Nevertheless, we have also seen the prophetic spirit of criticism and energy grow stronger. People around the country are sensing that the time has come to create something new altogether. This is the spirit of the campaign that was organized by Repairers of the Breach, which is a social justice organization led by the Reverend William Barber, who came out of the North Carolina NAACP and the Moral Monday movement, if you're familiar with those. And also the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary, which is co-directed by Reverend Liz Theo Harris. So Barber and Theo Harris are the initiators of this Poor People's Movement. Together, they're building a multiracial, multi-religious coalition that they describe as this new and unsettling force against the systems which have long ignored them. These organizations have spent the last few years prior to this initial beginning of the campaign engaging in grassroots organizing all over the country in order to energize that mass movement of people who are willing to take seriously the promise that God can and will do a new thing in this world. The movement, as I said, is multiracial and interreligious, reflecting the diversity of people who are no longer willing to cooperate with the dominant culture. The campaign's first efforts are focused on 40 days of nonviolent civil disobedience, which will initiate on Mother's Day of this year and culminate in a massive action in Washington, D.C. in June. Nonviolent civil disobedience is, of course, a tactic used by Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, but has historically been a central tactic in movements against injustice. When people use their bodies and refuse to cooperate with unjust laws, that is a different statement than using legal means and other kinds of means. Right? Refusing to cooperate with laws that are unjust, that keep people poor, that keep people sick, that keep people from becoming the sorts of people that God intended us to be. And using our bodies is also a message, a very powerful way to communicate to other people around you that they are not alone. So they recently released what they describe as the Declaration of Fundamental Rights and the Poor People's Moral Agenda. In it, they argue, and I quote here, that we must see the human and economic costs of inequality. We believe that when decent people see the faces and facts that the souls of poor folk audit represents, I'll return to that in a second, they will be moved deeply in their conscience to change things. When confronted with the undeniable truth of unconscionable cruelty to our fellow human beings, we must join the ranks of those who are determined not to rest until justice and equality are available to all. So the Souls of Poor Folk audit is the conversations that they've been having over the course of a few years, learning from folks about what their struggles are.
Did you say the Declaration of Human Rights, or what was that?
I said the Declaration of Fundamental Rights and Poor People's Moral Agenda. They have identified 5 key areas in their declaration, which expands on the 3 giants that Martin Luther King identified. So many of you know me, so you know that I could spend like an hour on every single one of these. I won't do that to you. I'm just going to give an incredibly unsatisfying bird's eye view of each one. And we'll just do our best. There will be time for questions afterwards. But I also wanted to highlight how these issues are all deeply interconnected. So we cannot fully understand the impact of any one without seeing how they are related to the others. So, and I warn you in advance, you probably aren't going to feel super awesome when I get to the end of this list, but we'll get there together, and I won't leave you there. So we live in a country that is deeply scarred by racism, that has been embedded into the very fabric of our laws, our policies, and our communities. For instance, we might consider the mass incarceration of Black and brown people who are disproportionately arrested and imprisoned, who are disproportionately the targets of police violence. Or we might think of how there are fewer voting rights in 2018 than there were 50 years ago when we adopted the Voting Rights Act, due to things like voter ID laws that discriminate against poor people and against people of color, and policies such as interstate cross-check, which removed millions of people from voter rolls in the 2016 election. And when the research has been done into those voter rolls, or the people that were removed, there are almost none of the people removed were actually duplicate voters. The second is poverty and inequality. So one issue here is the wage gap, right? The gap between how much CEOs receive each year in total compensation versus how much the average worker receives in wages. Does anybody want to guess what the ratio is? What to what? 5 to 1? 20 to 1?
How about 354?
Okay, 354 to 1. In 2015, it was 827 to 1. So in 1970, the wage gap between the top 100 wealthiest CEOs was 45 to the average worker's 1. That isn't even the wealth gap, you guys, which is even more significantly skewed, right? We know that half of the world's wealth is owned by 8 people. Half. The economy, despite the economic crash of 2008, continues to grow, but that growth is not being passed down to the vast majority of workers, the ones who are doing the mass majority of work for our economy. There is a crisis of a lack of affordable housing, a lack of affordable health insurance. People die because they can't go to the doctor. Parents struggle to put food on the table, and they have to choose between food and rent and medicine for their kids. College students live in their cars or don't have enough to eat. There is a growing, and I think many of us are familiar with this, some of us more than others, but student debt is astronomical and is shackling a generation of people to a really uncomfortable future. The third is ecological devastation. And this, of course, includes a concern about the existential threat of human-caused climate change and the complete refusal of at the federal level to do anything meaningful to address it, and in many cases going back on positive momentum. But importantly, the campaign's focus is actually on the stunning impact on local communities. This issue cannot be unmoored from issues of race and class. When we look at the places where companies put their factories and dispose of their chemicals, those communities are full of black and brown people. They're full of people who are poor. Those people have disproportionate health problems that aren't being treated because they can't afford the medical care.
Well, just think of New Orleans.
Exactly. New Orleans is a great case in point. People still do not have housing. How many years after Katrina? Are we 10, 11? Right. There are 13.8 million US households that cannot afford running water. We are not even talking necessarily about Native Americans living on reservations who have never had running water. Sorry? That's my next point. Flint, in particular, is notorious for still not, years later, having clean water. Still not.
But the governor just declared it. If you believe it.
So not only is Flint not providing clean and safe water for its citizens, just last week, Michigan granted Nestle a permit to double the rate of extraction of clean drinking water from the White Pine Springs. So instead of 240,000 gallons per day, they are now going to extract 500,000 gallons of fresh water every day that they will sell to the people of Flint and across the country for almost no cost. It's truly unbelievable what is happening there. Getting all worked up, guys, sorry. The war economy and militarism. Currently, 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar goes to military spending. Well, only 15 cents per dollar is spent on social services or anti-poverty programs. Yet, Congress argues unceasingly that we ought to slash the social safety net, that the little that we do have, while our military budget far surpasses any other military budget in the world. Most of that money is actually given to private contractors. It doesn't go directly to the Department of Defense. Or it goes to the Department of Defense and then they spend it on contractors. In 2016, the CEOs of the top 5 military contractors earned on average $19.2 million each, which is 90 times the $214,000 that is earned by US generals with 20 years of military experience. And that is 640 times the $30,000 that Army infantry people who are fighting those wars receive.
That's why Johnson's war on poverty was war on the poor.
Yeah.
I worked for Head Start, and it was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the people I worked with were incredible. It was
Yeah.
all about their salaries.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a baby having a baby. That
Yeah.
was the face of poverty.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's important because, like, we talk about the first 3 things, but it's interesting to me in our culture how the war economy and militarism are a sacred cow that cannot be touched. Right? So we're going there. Every day, an average of 20 US veterans commit suicide. Every day. In addition to wars abroad, we're also witnessing a rapid militarization of our police force and the immigration and customs enforcement. We're talking about sending the National Guard once again to our borders. The militarization that concerned Dr. King 50 years ago has expanded exponentially in scope. And millions of people at home and abroad are suffering and dying of the consequences. Finally, the campaign seeks to address a national morality that deems all of what I just said as acceptable, as just the way things are, as the functioning of a free market that we cannot touch. And not only that, but it also says much of the time that this is the Christian way to do things. In particular, the campaign is calling out the national moral narrative that is consumed by debates about abortion and gay marriage, while seemingly undisturbed about the millions of Americans who are hungry and poor and homeless and seemingly abandoned by their society. The campaign states that the truth is that a morality that claims to care for the souls of people while destroying their bodies and communities is deeply immoral. We have the right to ground our public policies and budget allocations in a moral narrative that prioritizes and follows our religious and constitutional moral commitments. Okay. So that's the dominant culture. Yep. So it is in that context, that criticism, out of which the Poor People's Campaign seeks to energize us. It does not want to leave us in that despair. It wants to call us out into something new. And that something new is each of us, right? Each of us has the power to, when we work together, do that something new. So I have a video, a very short video of the campaign, and then we're going to talk about what to do.
The Poor People's Campaign.
The Poor People's Campaign.
The Poor People's Campaign.
Poor People's Campaign is an invitation to be active.
To connect to one another and know that we're not alone.
What it's going to take to actually lift the load here.
Is permission to breathe.
It's a very important time politically to build a mass movement for the people.
We're the poor black people of Britain and Scotland and Ireland who were transported and evicted from those countries.
The new Poor People's Campaign is a way to bring those pillars of oppression crashing down. We have to do something different this time.
We can speak for ourselves. We can fight for ourselves. We can lead, not just ourselves, but this nation.
Yes.
All the propaganda that we deal with is to the opposite, to suggest that the problem is us, that we need fixing and not this damn system.
If you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're poor. And I want people to understand that being poor doesn't mean them, it means us.
The unity that we're looking for is based on this commonality of loss, of poverty, of dispossession, and that's what's going to bring us together to think about ways to begin to overcome this and to change the capitalist system, the killer system that we're all confronted with.
If we are suffering the same pain, we might as well just get together and fight it together.
We've all agreed that we need to reignite the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign.
Beauty is restored again. It is done, my friends. Let's make up.
Okay, so how can I get involved? These are just a few ideas. I hope that you have many more, right? There are an infinite number of ways that you can be involved in this or in something else. Keep learning and asking questions and learning how to ask questions, right? So opportunities like this, taking classes. If you're a UD student, we have so many classes that dig deeper into these issues. Asking questions of our leaders, asking questions of the media, asking questions of each other to understand better what's going on and how people are being impacted. And then learning how to ask questions, I think, is sometimes something that we don't know how to do. I don't know always how to do, right? How to ask good questions, because it's hard to know what you don't know. right? So hearing from perspectives that are different than your own, making the intentional decision to read books by people that don't look like you or have different kinds of lives than you do, right? Going to places that you have never been and talking to those folks. Listen to people's stories and tell your own. I can't tell you how many times I teach classes here at UD and hear stories from my students about the sorts of struggles that they have endured. Every single student on this campus has an incredible story and has been touched by many of those things identified by the Poor People's Campaign. What if we told those stories? What if we did not feel shame for the things we experienced as though they were our fault, but we properly understood that we are within a system that is not set to benefit us? What if we told those stories without shame and without fear? What would that do? If you are interested in getting involved with the Poor People's Campaign specifically, you can go to their website, get more information, participate, right? There are webinars that are happening right now, opportunities to get more deeply involved in nonviolent civil disobedience, and other sorts of things. And you could start something, right? One of the most empowering experiences of my life is when I realized that you can just do a thing, right? And people will probably not stop you right at first, right? Do a thing. Well, thank you. Again, if you do want to get involved, I'm happy to connect you with all sorts of things to do. We got a long list, so have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.